to allow everybody to join this session today. So we'll start in 1 minute. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. My name is Elena Cedillo. I am the program executive for climate justice in the Lutheran World Federation. I give you the warmest welcome to Voices of Hope and Faith, sharing visions of living in harmony with nature. As an event organized in the framework of the United Nations Environmental Assembly, by the Lutheran World Federation, the ACT Alliance, the World Council of Churches, and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, to highlight the work of faith communities, and especially indigenous, women, and youth faith leaders in mobilizing collective global action to protect nature and biodiversity, and deliver critical reflections on enhanced biodiversity governance for climate resilience. To make sure that we can include as many people as possible, we are providing simultaneous interpretation. To access to this, please go to the bottom of your screen. You can find a globe. Please click it and select the language of your preference, English, Spanish, or French. I will switch into Spanish now. Tenemos traducción simultánea al español. Por favor, pueden ir hacia la parte baja de su pantalla y ahí encontrarán un icono de globo. Hagan clic en el icono y escojan español. And now in French.
Ok, alors pour pouvoir accéder à ce webinaire en langue française, je vous prie de cliquer sur le globe que vous pouvez voir au bas de votre écran et choisissez le français. Merci.
This session also will be recorded, and you can introduce yourself using the chat. You can write your name, organization, and your country. And I invite you to write your questions for panelists in the question and the Q&A chat. For the ones who are following in YouTube, you can also write your question on the YouTube chat. To start our session today, I would like to introduce the moderator, Mr. Rudemar Bueno de Faria. He is the General Secretary of the ACT Alliance, an international coalition of 156 churches and faith-based organizations, working together in humanitarian development and advocacy work in over 120 countries. Prior to this, he served as the World Council of Churches representative to the United Nations and Deputy Director for the Lutheran World Service. He has over 25 years of experience working with national and international faith-based organizations. Over to you, Burghardt.
Thank you very much, Elena, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. As a moderator, also, I would like to welcome all the participants to this online side event, to the 5th session of the United Nations Environmental Assembly. And this event is called, as you saw, Voices of Hope and Faith. And the purpose of this event is to mobilize collective action, global action, to protect nature and biodiversity and deliver critical reflections on enhanced biodiversity governance for climate resilience and posterity. And this event is organized, as Elena mentioned, by the Lutheran World Federation together with ACT Alliance and the World Council of Churches, and also the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. Today, I will be moderating a panel comprised of 5 wonderful professionals and activists who have been taking the lead in many fronts related to the climate change and biodiversity. They come from different regions and bring comparable but also specific perspectives on climate and biodiversity, based on their own context and experiences as well. The panel will be a space for sharing views, different visions of living in harmony with nature. And that is very much in line with the theme, with the main theme of the Environmental Assembly as well. But before introducing our dearest panel members, I would like to introduce Reverend Anne Burghardt, the first ever woman as General Secretary of the Lutheran World Federation. She will give the opening remarks for this important event. But let me first to introduce her here. Since November 2021, Reverend Anne Burghardt serves as General Secretary of the Lutheran World Federation in Geneva, Switzerland. From 2006 to 2013, she worked as head of the master study program called Studies in Christian Culture, and as the head of department of the theological faculty at the Institute of Theology of the Estonian Evangelical Lutheran Church. She worked at the Lutheran World Federation before, from 2013 to 2018, and actually we had the opportunity to overlap 6 months working together in the same organizations. And she was the Secretary for Ecumenical Relations and was coordinating the content of the 2017 Assembly of the Lutheran World Federation. During this period, she edited a booklet that I believe that many of you have read, called Creation, Not for Sale, highlighting the need to care for the climate and to address climate justice issues. Before joining the LWF again in 2021, she worked at her home church in Estonia, being on a part-time basis an advisor for ecumenical and international relations at the church office, while also serving as the head of development at the Estonian Evangelical Lutheran Church Institute of Theology. She has large experiences in various projects, among others, on intercultural learning, peace building, and conflict resolution. Reverend Anne, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rudelma, for your introductory words. Respected representatives from governments, the UNEP and other UN agencies, faith leaders, delegates, dear friends. It gives me great joy to take part in this event today, which we have organized in the framework of the resumed 5th session of the United Nations Environment Assembly. We are living in a time of emergency with a triple crisis of climate change, nature and biodiversity loss, as well as pollution and waste. We are witnesses of how people and our common home, planet Earth, are suffering as a result. More than ever before, urgent action is needed to avoid the worst effects of these planetary crises. As people of faith, we have a unique understanding and appreciation of nature and creation. We know that we are called to live in harmony with creation and to not abuse, misuse, or exhaust it. Sadly, this is not what we see in the way we run our economies, development, and societies in the world today. In the light of the war in Ukraine, we also clearly see the devastating consequences of distorting the relationship between ecology and power. We hear again about threatening with the use of nuclear weapons to desecrate life. News about capturing Chernobyl in Ukraine evoke memories of the dreadful impact on ecology and human health caused by the explosion at this nuclear plant in 1986. The sin of seeking power over our fellow creatures and the earth has real effects measured in the loss of life, social and ecological harmony that lasts for generations. Climate change cannot be denied. Scientific evidence shows that human activities are responsible for approximately 1.1 degrees Celsius of global warming since 1900. The latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report confirms the catastrophic effects of a global warming of 1.5 degrees. So far, the commitments for greenhouse gas emissions reduction submitted by governments under the national determined contributions in the most optimistic scenario lead us to a trajectory of 2.4 degrees of global warming. This is deeply concerning. It is important to remember that environmental sustainability is a crucial enabling factor for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, a broad range of human rights and dignity for all. The overall theme for UNEA 5, strengthening actions for nature to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, connects very well with our faith convictions and practices. Conserving each living thing and their ecosystems is critical to maintaining the intricate balance of the web of creation. As faith-based actors, we raise our voices, increase awareness, build capacity, and take action on climate, environment, and nature protection. We also take action to protect the lives and livelihoods of people and communities affected by the impacts of climate change and environmental degradation. The Lutheran World Federation is very committed to contributing to UNEP's policy decisions from a local to a global perspective. We are locally rooted in nearly every bioregion of the world, engaging in dialogue with local communities that inform and shape our global advocacy. The theological and spiritual gifts of the Lutheran tradition help us cultivate an ecological sense of being human and a vocation to care for the well-being of all creation. Since 1970s, the Lutheran World Federation has acted as a prophetic voice, raising awareness about the ecological crisis among its constituencies. Creation not for sale, one of the themes addressed during the 12th LWF Assembly in Namibia in 2017, underlined theologically that nature has to be fully respected and protected as God's good creation, entrusted to human care. The LWF member churches emphasized the need to have compassion for all living things and the moral imperative to care for the earth while protecting the lives, livelihoods, and dignity of the most vulnerable people. More recently, the LWF Council adopted a resolution on the protection of biodiversity, recognizing that the concept of biodiversity also has theological roots. Biodiversity is God's wisdom woven into the web of life. Protecting biodiversity and guarding against habitat loss are essential to sustaining healthy ecosystems and preserving just, peaceful, and healthy societies. Remembering the generational wisdom of our traditions that call us back to our human vocation to till, keep, and safeguard creation can help to resist temptations to exercise power over our fellow creatures and to abuse the nature. Indigenous people, women, and youth play a key role in earthkeeping, taking action and moving towards protecting the world. I celebrate the vital role and commitment of youth in addressing the triple planetary crisis which afflicts us, especially addressing the climate emergency as one of the major causes of the catastrophic rate of species extinction. LWF actively involves youth in the matters of climate justice. The youth have led LWF delegations to COP, and now for the first time, they are delegates of the UNEA Assembly. There is a deep connection between faith and action. We are called to act and advocate out of concern for the future of creation, the sustenance of life for future generations. I am grateful to our partners, ACT Alliance, WCC, and ELCA, who together with the LWF have made this event a reality. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Annie, for your opening remarks. It's great to hear from you about the time of emergencies that we are living now and the role of faith actors and faith-based organizations in this context. You also mentioned the relation of climate and the situation of conflict which further undermine efforts to tackle climate change. And it's very relevant, the theme of the LWF Assembly, creation, not for sale. It's much more relevant than ever. Thank you very much. Now, I would like to have the pleasure to introduce our panelists for the discussions today. It's my pleasure to introduce the 5 speakers at once, but please pay close attention to their respective associations, the regions they come from, and the experiences they have when they will be introducing them. From the Africa Pacific region, MENA Jennifer Vai. She's from Samoa, but living in Fiji and working as the ecumenical enabler for the Pacific Conference of Churches. She's currently doing her postgraduate studies in climate change at the University of the South Pacific and graduated with the bachelor's in environmental management in the region. Welcome, MENA. In representation of South America, and here I feel a little bit more comfortable with the pronunciation, Fernanda Zuniga. She's a member of the Lutheran Church in Chile, where she has been the national coordinator of youth ministry since 2018. She belongs to the LWF Youth Reformer Program and has managed climate justice programs around education and mitigation. She has attended the COP25 and the COP26 as an LWF delegate. In this last period, she has been involved in the areas of gender and youth around climate change. From Central America, Rocabed Solano. She's an indigenous woman from the Gunadale Nation in Panama, a theologian and activist. She directs Memoria Indígena, Indigenous Memory, and serves with the United World Mission. In representation of Africa, the always young Colin Srava. Collins is originally from Zimbabwe, and he's currently the Executive Secretary for Youth at All Africa Conference of Churches, AACC, and he's a holder of a Master in Public Policy and Governance from the African University in Zimbabwe. He's a former program assistant for economic justice and youth empowerment at the Zimbabwean Council of Churches. He's also a researcher in climate change and environmental issues, and he's a founding member of the Zimbabwe Youth in Environmental Research Advocacy. And last but not least, from North America, Maura Kitson West. She's a working student at SEEK, S-E-E-K, Development, where they are a member of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations and donor tracker project teams. At SEEK, Maura publishes policy updates for the donor tracker, analyzing policy and funding trends in development, and she co-manages social media campaigns. Maura is pursuing a joint master in political science from Humboldt Universität zu Berlin and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So, as indicated in the beginning, this is an interactive panel, and we want to leave ample space for discussions. For this reason, all speakers will be in conversation with each other rather than to be introducing papers or making PowerPoint presentations. And each speaker will address an initial question, and they are kindly asked to keep their intervention to a maximum of 5 minutes. I will start asking the first question to Imeima. You are a young person from the Pacific, and I recall that we had an event in the COP26 in Glasgow. And we know that you come from a region that is especially impacted by climate change and whose people are deeply connected to ocean and land. In this regard, Imeima, could you share about the Rewaving the Ecological Mat project that the churches in the Pacific are spearheading? What it's about, and what is the role of young people like you in promoting this initiative?
Thank you, Rodmar. I think I'd like to start by saying thank you to the facilitators for this opportunity to share on the REM project, or Reweaving the Ecological Map. For us here in the Pacific, climate change is not a new topic. As a matter of fact, when it comes to climate change, the Pacific is well known to other countries for its vulnerability, and we are often portrayed as victims in the global climate narrative that is today. Yes, us in the Pacific indeed face many major impacts of increasingly strong storms and rising sea levels, but we also have many ways of facing up to the changes. In fact, Pacific Islanders offer ways to teach other nations about resilience and coping through their use of indigenous knowledge and spirituality. And this can be seen through this project. So the Reweaving the Ecological Mat, or REM initiative, is premised on the knowledge and experience that the neoliberal model of economic development is not appropriate for the Pacific. While it is acknowledged that this model of development has led to some improvements to human life in the Pacific and across the world in general, it is not beneficial to the common good of the vast majority of the world's people, including the Pacific. In real terms, it benefits only a very tiny minority of the world's population, which is the richest and economically most powerful individuals and groups. The ecological crisis, or climate change, which brings in the ecological crisis, threatening Pacific livelihoods, comes from a very dominant Eurocentric narrative that extracts all abundance to serve the civilization of the human. As colonization took place in the Pacific, a powerful narrative had to be created to justify the elevation of one life or one culture above others. It thrived on the ideology that all cultures have to be rescued from this backwardness of their ways and offered a more developed way, a way that animated by the vision of endless growth. This ideology then shifted into a narrative that advocated a worldview that believed that the survival of many lives is dependent upon rendering service to only one life, which is human, or to one culture, which is the neoliberal capitalist culture. Where we are today in the Pacific is a continuation of this colonial worldview, which has thus resulted in a destructive and unsustainable lifestyle through the commodification of life, the increased exploitation of extractive activities, the market-pushed consumerism that nourishes a few, increased poverty and violence, and a single-stranded way of understanding reality. Such a worldview that has led to the compartmentalization of life, roles, and responsibilities, all of which fall outside of the relational interconnectedness of the whole. So for this, the proposed ecological framework of this project that is offered by this project recommends and offers an oikonomical framing of development. This is a word that was coined by the creators of this project to suggest the much needing reweaving of the oikos triplets of economy, ecology, and oikomene if the Pacific is to be truthful to establishing a holistic development story. So as this project took place, young people also started to take recognition of this project and its value to our Pacific communities, and then decided to create a youth movement in this initiative to roll out the advocacy and awareness of the framework. Throughout the last 2.5 years, or actually 3 years, we have managed to roll out the project in 2 countries and are currently implementing it in Fiji with the community of Bua. Whilst we recognize the value of engaging on a global level, we believe that the most crucial engagements are with our local communities who are on the front lines of this ecological crisis. We have managed to document and capture frontline truths through a form of talanoa, or storytelling, which has been used as a form of sharing knowledge by our Pacific cultures for centuries. And we have also had the privilege to work with our elders to publish our REM publication, which holds visions of what our Pacific communities envision in their people when it comes to trying to bring ecological justice to the picture. Lastly, we have also been able to create partnerships with like-hearted organizations such as the Utuniala, where we implement projects on waste management and sustainable sea transportation through the revival of traditional sailing and navigation. So to wrap up, all of these take recognition of the value indigenous knowledge and spirituality brings when it comes to ecological justice, and it allows the narrative to shift to one that is relational and whole. The dominant climate narrative that is today usually often ignores our indigenous spirituality, and from there creates climate solutions from a secular approach, which fails to give clarity on the deep unseen wounds of our indigenous people. As indigenous people of the Pacific, we recognize a deep relationship that's woven between humankind and the environment. And through our cultures, we are able to continue and upkeep the culture of respect we hold with our land, or our Mother Earth. So this project is one that is able to really make meaningful change in our world and can allow economies to see the benefits of prioritizing the well-being of our ecology, creating a harmony of balance for all of creation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Fafetai Imeima. I hope that I have pronounced well. That is Samoan. Yeah,
you have.
This is indeed a very interesting project, and just confirmed the critical role that young people play in bringing a positive agenda followed by actions to bring hope to humanity. And I like especially your reference to colonization, which is an important thing that we need to address, decolonizations, as well as the neoliberal model that you have mentioned of development, which is not appropriated for the regions, and also the role of indigenous spirituality in tackling all these issues. Thank you very much for that. Now I want to ask to Fernanda from Chile. Fernanda, unprecedented changes in climate and biodiversity driven by human activities, as it was mentioned several times, have combined and increasingly threatened nature, human lives and livelihoods and well-being around the world. But in this scenario, youth are giving us hope. Could you please share with us, not in more than 5 minutes, please, from your own context, how youth are mobilizing collective global action to protect nature and biodiversity? The floor is yours.
Buenas tardes y muchas gracias por la invitación el día de hoy a compartir con ustedes nuestras experiencias. Les voy a hablar un poco desde la perspectiva de los jóvenes en el cono sur de América. Si bien hay países que son afectados más fuertemente que otros en el ámbito del cambio climático, la región latinoamericana se ha visto fuertemente afectada en los últimos años, e incluso podemos ver en los últimos meses las intensas lluvias en Brasil o las altas temperaturas en la zona norte de Argentina. Todos estos eventos nos señalan que el reloj del desastre climático sigue avanzando, y nuestras acciones no han sido lo suficientemente fuertes para impactar y frenar el avance del cambio climático. Recientemente, la Organización de las Naciones Unidas señaló que tendríamos que acostumbrarnos a vivir rodeados de incendios. Pero mi pregunta es, ¿por qué deberíamos acostumbrarnos a ver cómo nuestro planeta se quema en vez de tomar acciones eficaces frente a ello? Por otra parte, el IPCC señaló que las temperaturas aumentarán más que el promedio mundial en Latinoamérica. El nivel del mar subirá, las sequías aumentarán, los glaciares se derretirán más rápidamente, habrán zonas de América del Sur donde las lluvias aumentarán drásticamente, y estas son solo algunas de las consecuencias que tendrá el cambio climático en la región. Muchas advertencias se han hecho al respecto, y como jóvenes no podemos quedarnos quietos frente a todo lo que está sucediendo y lo que está por suceder. En este sentido, es que los jóvenes del Cono Sur hemos comenzado diversas acciones, tanto a nivel local como regional y global, que poco a poco van adquiriendo fuerza e impacto. Soy fiel creyente de que las pequeñas acciones pueden crear un gran impacto, y es posible verlo a través de diversas acciones que se están tomando en Latinoamérica, desde acciones en hogares, escuelas e iglesias, a las que llamaría de menor escala, a otras de gran envergadura que desarrollan fundaciones, empresas y los gobiernos. Creo que en este sentido los jóvenes cobran vital importancia, son el motor de muchas de estas iniciativas y que poco a poco van traspasando las fronteras y replicándose. Proyectos que dan resultado en algunos lugares son replicados y puestos en práctica en otros. donde se van complementando prácticas y adquiriendo nuevas aristas, las cuales han tenido impacto a la hora de hacer frente a la crisis climática. Prácticas como planes de reforestación en zonas degradadas, en donde miles de jóvenes son voluntarios, sistemas de reciclaje o el establecimiento de huertos comunitarios, como forma de disminuir la huella de carbono. Hasta la incidencia política son distintas de las formas que podemos ver a los jóvenes interviniendo y alzando la voz para señalar que nuestro planeta no puede esperar más o ya será tarde. En este sentido es que como organizaciones basadas en la fe, debemos potenciar la incidencia y las distintas acciones que los jóvenes están realizando. Los jóvenes tienen fuerzas y ganas de trabajar, porque los jóvenes no somos el futuro, somos el ahora, y vemos día a día cómo el reloj continúa avanzando y los desastres climáticos avanzan sin precedentes. Más del 60% de los jóvenes se consideran preocupados acerca del futuro, y un 45% señala que el cambio climático ya los afecta de una u otra forma en su día a día. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Fernanda. It's important what you said about the small actions that can lead to transformation and the vital role of young people in producing these changes. Young people are the highest or the biggest capital assets that any organization could have. And I think that the churches and the ecumenical movement and also the United Nations should take advantage of that. Thank you very much for that. Now to Rocabed, Solano. We all know that indigenous communities, and also MENA has already mentioned that, that indigenous communities are at the front line of the impact of climate change and biodiversity, the loss of biodiversity, but at the same time play a key role in safeguarding forests and protecting biodiversity. I think that Fernanda also mentioned in terms of Brazil and other parts in South America. But you, as an indigenous person of faith, could you tell us why indigenous perspectives and worldviews are critical for building solutions to the climate and biodiversity crisis? Could you share a story or an example from your context in Central America?
Bueno, muy buenos días, buenas tardes. Muchas gracias por la invitación y a la pregunta que nos hacen en esta jornada. Quisiera responder de la siguiente manera. Las cosmovisiones, pero también las cosmovivencias, es decir, desde las perspectivas indígenas, no solamente hay una relación desde lo cognitivo, sino desde los sentidos y desde los narrativos, cómo los pueblos indígenas se relacionan en una epistemología muy cercana a la hermenéutica de la tierra. Las cosmovivencias de los pueblos indígenas presentes en la memoria colectiva vivida de los pueblos indígenas nos han mostrado sabiduría y evidencia de sus buenas prácticas en armonía con la tierra. Los indígenas guardan el 80% de la biodiversidad, el resto la hemos exterminado. Desde esta vivencia concreta es importante responder a la pregunta: ¿hay una ruptura epistémica y ontológica en la vida del ser humano en general que ha contribuido a la crisis global del planeta? Y esta sabiduría que proviene de los pueblos indígenas es una sabiduría que viene con una relación estrecha intrínseca con la madre tierra. Es decir, para los pueblos indígenas somos parte de ella, profundamente cercana. Esta crisis espiritual está marcada, como bien dije, por la alienación con la madre tierra. El pueblo cunadule, de donde yo soy partícipe, comprende a la tierra como madre porque reconoce que emergemos de ella, somos alimentadas por la madre tierra y al morir cultivada en ella. Es por lo tanto que cambiar la narrativa del imaginario colectivo de nosotros y la tierra es fundamental en el aporte, por qué los pueblos indígenas pueden seguir aportando en la cosmovivencia y desde su cosmovisión. Y los pueblos indígenas lo entienden muy bien, Nosotros somos parte de ella, como el bebé está unido al cordón umbilical con su mamá. Canta el hermano y la hermana cuna en la hamaca al tener a su bebé recién nacido. Le va contando las historias de cómo la madre tierra ha alimentado al cunadule, y por lo tanto desde allí podemos ver estas historias y narrativas profundas. En este sentido, aprender de las maneras de vivir de los pueblos indígenas es importante. Los pueblos indígenas, desde su cosmovivencia comunitaria, integral, holística y relacional, es decir, en relación con toda la comunidad de creación cosmos, incluyendo al ser humano, nos proponen formas de vida en donde prevalecen las relaciones de respeto, de equidad. Por ejemplo, cada espacio donde habitan los seres vivientes es sagrado. En mi pueblo le llaman galo, y no talamos los árboles sin permiso, reconocemos la grandeza y la diversidad de las plantas. Mi abuelo decía que el texto más antiguo son las plantas. Los árboles y las plantas son ancestras, llenas de sabiduría. Por eso, en relación con ella, aprendemos las propiedades curativas y de vivencia de los pueblos. En otras palabras, son las plantas, los textos sagrados. Por lo tanto, la Madre Tierra es la teóloga y es el espacio teologal de la relación del Creador, la divinidad, con la comunidad cósmica, incluyéndonos a nosotros como seres humanos. En contraste a los sistemas de dominación orientadas al individualismo, consumismo, competitividad caníbal y destrucción de la vida, incluyendo la tierra. Además, se reconoce que todo está relacionado. Por lo tanto, desde una mirada indígena cristiana, la salvación es holística y debe ser sistémica, tocando todo sistema, tanto humano como ecológico, es decir, siendo nosotros parte de la madre tierra. La cosmovivencia es de un ser integral, no cabe el dualismo en lo ontológico, epistemológico, teológico ni antropológico. Por lo tanto, la complementariedad es fundamental en todos los aspectos de la vida diaria y la cosmovivencia holística. Por lo tanto, algún ejemplo para finalizar: en mi pueblo se realiza la ceremonia de mi primer árbol, donde cada vez que nace un bebé se planta un árbol de cualquier fruto. Reconocemos que al plantar un árbol nos relacionamos una vez más con la tierra, con los ancestros que caminaron en la tierra, con la comunidad que está viva en este momento. Y cuando damos el primer fruto, el árbol da su primer fruto, se toma la bebida y una vez más reconocemos nuestra relación con la tierra. La sabiduría de los pueblos indígenas emerge de la tierra. Por lo tanto, siendo pueblos milenarios que conocen la tierra, es importante una vez más escuchar las voces de las sabidurías de los pueblos indígenas. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Jocobed. Indeed, the cosmovision and cosmo-living that you mentioned is not the same. Is not the same understanding for people living in the big cities. And the indigenous thinking is that we are part of nature. And these also have theological basis, as you know. But we often think only on human beings. And this hurts nature and the creation of God, if you will not see in this integral part, as you have mentioned. And I like your sharing about planting trees when the baby is born in your community. Thank you very much for that. And now we will go to Colin Shaba. The questions go to you, Collins. But I will always remember that we have 5 minutes. Everybody's doing that very well. Thank you very much. Collins, as a young national from Zimbabwe, and building on what you has been said by Fernanda previously, can you please share with us from your own context how youth are mobilizing collective actions, especially global actions, to protect nature and biodiversity? And Collins is based in Nairobi, so he's in the place where the assembly is taking place right now. Collins, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dioma, the moderator, and everyone else. I'm going to share broadly from a Zimbabwean context and from an African context as well. And I would like to thank Fernanda for showing the way and leading the way, speaking about what young people are doing. But in my country, localizing it to my country, Zimbabwe, that is already feeling the effects of climate change, just like the rest of other places in the global south, I see that the country has been able to create policies, has been able to create platforms to advance the climate change agenda. But most of the people, the youth included, the issues of climate change have not been a priority at the moment. I think because of the economic situation that we face in the country, where young people think more about having jobs or think more about having the next meal and something like that. But in the issues of climate change and how it's going to affect us, then comes as another issue, but not a priority. So hence, that is why, for example, when right now our government is trying to expand coal power plants, exploration of gas and oil and other fossil fuels, there's little noise about it. I think it's because of this context where people tend to think more about themselves before they think about the environment and the climate change. But alas, we have seen that despite the context that we have, despite the current environment, we see that there's a rise in youth voices in Zimbabwe and in the continent at large, where you see youth voices coming up from their communities to influencing global policy levels. This has been largely due to or through individual voices, where we see individual activism of enlightened young people that are leading the front in defending the environment. We have also seen the work of civil society organizations that are bringing young people or volunteers of young people to organize themselves and to contribute to the climate change. In addition, we have seen the government in Zimbabwe and the governments in Africa also creating spaces for young people to also share and open their views around climate change. But what strikes me the most is the individual level or the individual activism we have seen amongst the young people, where we see strong voices emerging who are pushing the narrative on climate justice. For example, in my country, we have seen those young individuals organizing themselves under the banner of the Africa Youth Initiative on Climate Change, where they have been leading initiatives for tree planting, where they've been leading initiative for the environment, on plastic collection, on plastic waste, where they've been leading initiatives to clean up the lakes and the dams. And this is what the young people are trying to do. And we hope to see more of these initiatives coming up. And in addition, we have seen that this group of individual young people organizing themselves, even at policy level, at national level, where we have seen in Zimbabwe, where we've seen young people playing a crucial role in shaping the policies and the acts on climate change. And this is a plus for the young people. And at the international level, we have seen young people airing out their voices from Africa to ensure that climate change discussions also shape the discussions for a better Africa, for a better world as well, and to also limit the greenhouse gas emissions. But alas, I also agree that more needs to be done to ensure that we have more young people on board, and we also have more young people leading initiatives and innovation and entrepreneurship innovation to ensure that they can respond to the current climate crisis, to the current environmental challenges that we have in our spaces and in our local communities. And also, more so, there's more need to amplify the meaningful youth voices nationally and internationally for global action. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Asante Collins. It's absolutely right to say that climate change is not a priority for many, including the international community and people in general, for several reasons, as you have indicated some. But one important point that you mentioned is related to the role of the community-led initiatives, the communities tracking climate change, which have a stronger influence in the global space, especially in terms of advocacy, when people can share and speak out the difficulties they are living. And the young people, as you mentioned, they are lifting their voice, but more than that, they are acting. They are part of the big movement, and they are also setting the example for adults that sometimes are too much accommodated on this topic of climate change. Thank you very much, Asante. Now we will invite Mora. And Mora, based on your experiences as a student at SIG in Germany for the last year, how was your perspective, or how has your perspective evolved, or what differences do you see now regarding the geographical differences between US and Germany, where you are commuting on these two countries, on how youth leaders engage in global actions to protect nature and biodiversity?
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to participate. I'll discuss more the political and discursive leadership of youth leaders, as it's the area with which I'm most familiar. But both in the US and Germany more broadly across the board, as well as Europe, I would say that youth are the most active voices in mobilizing to address climate change. We see young leaders in spaces of political, economic, and social power fighting to mainstream and address climate change practically. And we see those who don't necessarily hold such broad political or economic power fighting to make their voices heard in both the US and Germany, as well as Europe more broadly. I think that the generational divide is significantly more apparent for me than necessarily a geographical one between the US and Europe. That being said, I think that this generational divide is at least in part due to the fact that generations, or like my generation and generations after me, will be dealing daily with the effects of climate change if they aren't already, if for the foreseeable future, whereas older generations haven't necessarily had to have that lived experience yet, which you mentioned earlier. But most of us have the privilege right now not to know firsthand the degree to which the changing climate will affect us in the US and Europe, although we are seeing some more disasters like flooding in Germany over the summer, as well as increased wildfires in the West and the US. However, this level, the distinct difference is this level of active protest, political action, and general consciousness regarding climate change in protecting nature and biodiversity. I would say that this general political consciousness is significantly higher in Europe. It is much more mainstreamed and discussed more regularly at regular intervals in Europe than it is in the US, in part due to varying political structures, but also due to major activists on social media. For example, in Europe, Greta Thunberg is, and the Fridays for Future campaign on social media are huge drivers of this sort of political consciousness that's grown in Europe, but has not necessarily made its way to the US. I also think that youth leaders in Europe actually feel that they have a voice in climate action, whereas a lot of at least US youth leaders feel partially disenfranchised, especially when it comes to climate change. I don't necessarily think that a lot of youth leaders in the US at least feel like they have a voice that matters. So I think that one thing that I've noticed, at least here in Berlin at Humboldt, is I will walk to class and I'll see at least 3 climate protests a month, as well as like significant political demonstrations. And we are seeing legislation passed actively in other European governments, which takes into account climate change at the very least. However, in the US, the only time you would actively see a political demonstration for climate change would normally be on a university campus, which are obviously a great space for youth leadership and climate activist mobilization, but it's not necessarily as common in communities for youth leaders to be active in the US in climate change political movements. So I see more climate mainstreaming and climate conversations in Europe and a relevant connection to active government legislation in Europe than I do in the United States. I think that certainly the church could, and I hope it does, become a space for youth leaders to engage on climate change, both in the US and globally, in their communities as well as the world stage. So I had the privilege of attending COP26 this past year with LWF and the ELCA, which was a wonderful example, I think, of how other youth leaders from faith communities have a voice on the youth or on the global stage. But we also did a lot of work in our home communities. So those sorts of moments are really critical for engagement. But one thing that I do see that both the US and Europe struggle with are that both entities are high-income countries and much more well-equipped to address climate effects in our current capitalist system than those of low-income countries. So I think that both the US and Europe have been struggling to listen to, learn from, and elevate voices from low-income countries who are actively engaged in mitigation and adaptation efforts already. So as both Jochebed and Iemaima specifically mentioned, indigenous communities' connection to the earth, which both leaders and communities in North America and Europe have lost, is one area where both geographical regions specifically struggle.
Thank you very much, Maura. And I agree with you that youth are the most active to address climate change, absolutely, and they are motivators. And generational divide that you have mentioned is really a problem, not only in North America and in Europe, but we can see that in other parts of the other regions as well. And you mentioned the role political structures and social media, what are the differences between North America and Europe? And maybe in the future, we should also, it will be interesting to see how digital divide affects that as well in other regions of the planet where people sometimes do not have the means to activate this dimension as well. Thank you very much. We are quite on time in our agenda. So, but thank you very much for the 5 speakers for this first round. Now we will open the virtual floor for questions. You can raise your hand using the options that is available in Zoom, but as you are in a webinar, I think that will not be the question, possible. So I will ask to my colleague Fiona to just have a look in the question and answers chat. If we have some comments or questions to our distinguished speaker.
Yes, we've had a really lively chat all morning, and we have about 9 questions now, although a few of them are just sharing information. So roughly a lot of very positive feedback and a lot of interest in what all the speakers are saying. I'll pull a few things from the chat and then move to the questions. One was in terms of Jemima's presentation, people are asking for links, if she can share links. They're really inspired by what she was saying and inspired by what all the speakers were saying. And in addition, there was one question about youth, which I'll get back to later after I've read all of these questions here. So here's the first question. It's from Modest Pesha. Please, Jemima, would you please share more information on 1, the applicability of indigenous knowledge and spirituality, as well as 2, how the colonial worldview has contributed to injustice on the ecology in Asia Pacific? And he leaves his address. Rudelmar, shall I go through all of the questions and then you can direct them to people, or do you want to go through them one by one?
I think that we should collect those that are addressed to people. Okay. I think that Iemaima, if there is any other addressed to her, so that she can, no?
No, that's the only one that's to her. And then this asking her to share her links to some of the research she's done and to read some of the papers. So she may want to put that in the chat herself.
Okay, maybe let's take another 2 and then we will.
Okay, so there's another question here from Marian Amu Mensa. How can we link development to past or indigenous knowledge that help to conserve nature? Currently, people do not understand the knowledge as they view indigenous knowledge as redundant. How can we revitalize this knowledge in view of the fact that we are called by God to take care of what he has created? So that's a question from Marianne. And then there's, I think, a question for Sheva is the last one. Modest again. Glad to hear inclusion of young people in Zimbabwe, whereas many other parts of the world, especially in Africa, youth are still left behind in any kind of engagement level. Kindly share your experience of how Zimbabwe has succeeded in this and how AACC follow up on this matter after calling for youth engagement for degeneration. I'm not quite sure I understand the rest of the question, but it's a question to Collins asking how Zimbabwe has succeeded in mobilizing youth and having youth engaged.
Yeah, and there is a question also to go to MENA related to the destructiveness of neoliberal culture. So we will stop by here, and I will invite Yemema and also Jacobed to talk about these issues that were raised in terms of indigenous knowledge. I think that refers basically to both of you, because you have raised these issues, and both of you. I will hand over to Yemema first, and then Jacobed.
Thank you. I think I'll answer both questions and try to put them into one specific answer. So for us here in the Pacific, usually we have this ideal, or okay, how would I say it? Pacific Islanders here are born from relationships, and this is how our cultures and our indigenous way of thinking were shaped. We share relations with not only humanity, but with our environment, and we see our environment as part of our community. Through our traditional practices, it's helped to maintain a culture of respect for the other, so we do not extract resources and only take what is needed. For example, some of the traditional conservation methods that we have, as one example is, for you guys, for everyone else, everyone might know this as the marine protected areas. Now, for us here in the Pacific, we've had that method long implemented before by our ancestors, except it's more taken in a traditional approach. With this, we also weave in our spirituality by also creating it or bringing in a traditional ritual with it. For us in Samoa, we call it a fa'asau, where we then put a ban on a specific area in the ocean, and we therefore call it sacred or tabu, where we do not touch it for a period amount of time. And this is usually taken up when there's a special occasion that's happening in the village, whether that would be a funeral or whether that would be something to do with a newborn. This all comes in that occasion, that celebration that we have. And before we then lift up the ban, we have a ritual that takes place where we give thanks to our ancestors, or we give thanks to the environment before, and bless it so that it may continue, so its resources may continue to provide us with health. As I had mentioned before, we have traditional sailing, where it's begun to revive nowadays. And this is where we try to promote sustainable sea transportation and low carbon footprint by reviving this traditional sail and navigation, because it does not use fuel or oils that usually fiber boats or other boats do. Besides this, whether it would come to, I'll just give one more example. When a baby is born as well, we usually bury its umbilical cord with a tree as well, to show the connection between that baby and that tree as well. It all talks about our connection that we have to our land And this is the spirituality that then takes place on it. The only reason why indigenous knowledge is seen as redundant is because of colonization. This is why I like to say a lot to decolonize your mindset, because back then it was seen, because our spiritual way of living and thinking was not visualized, could not be visualized by the human eye. Colonizers therefore thought, no, it is not relevant because the human eye cannot visualize it. But us here in the Pacific, our relations go way beyond what our human eye can visualize. And this is why our indigenous way of thinking promotes the well-being, or prioritizes and supports the well-being of our communities, is because it shows the relations and the deep connections that we have with our environment and allows ourselves to live in an harmonious balance with our environment. So that's just pretty much what I can share from my end. I don't.
That is very, very good. Let's hear from Jacobet.
Sí, muchas gracias, Lemaima. Y también gracias a Marian por la pregunta. ¿Cómo vinculamos el conocimiento con las maneras de cómo los pueblos indígenas han cuidado la madre tierra? Creo que es muy importante, para agregar ya lo que Lemaima dijo, también pensar desde lo intercultural. El tema aquí es un abordaje muy profundo, porque desde las épocas históricas podemos ver cómo los pueblos indígenas, bien ha dicho Lemaima, han sido colonizados, hemos sido colonizados, pero también en ese proceso de colonización ha habido asimilación. Lo que quiero decir es que en la interculturalidad podemos encontrar en el proceso de conocernos y reconocernos un diálogo profundo para poder aprender de los pueblos indígenas. Creo que una pregunta válida también a la que Marian hace es, entonces, ¿cómo aprendemos de los pueblos indígenas? Porque ya sea desde las políticas de estados, ya sea también desde la iglesia y la sociedad general, muchas veces se ha trabajado más en enseñar a los pueblos indígenas, pero muy poco a preguntarnos cómo aprendemos de ellos, entonces, de ellas. Yo creo que es necesario ese proceso de interculturalidad que nos permite entonces no solamente superficialmente decir que conocemos algo, sino más bien a profundidad conocer realmente el universo simbólico de los pueblos indígenas, es decir, su sabiduría. Este conocimiento no se da solamente en la academia a través de los estudios, a través de las investigaciones. Este conocimiento se da en la vivencia, es decir, de cómo nos incomodamos nosotros para realmente aprender de los pueblos indígenas, viviendo y aprendiendo con y con ellas las formas y prácticas milenarias de cómo cuidan su tierra. Por otro lado, creo que es muy importante también pensar en este caminar intergeneracional que han tenido las abuelas, los abuelos con los jóvenes, los niños y las niñas en las comunidades indígenas a través de los relatos y cantos. Mi pregunta quizás para la audiencia es ¿cuántos de nosotros conocemos relatos o cantos de los pueblos indígenas que hablan la profundidad espiritual de su relación con la madre tierra? Esto nos lleva a realmente a plantearnos preguntas muy profundas en lo epistemológico, es decir, ¿qué nosotros conocemos de la sabiduría de los pueblos indígenas a partir de sus relatos y cantos? En mi pueblo, por ejemplo, cada semana se canta un relato ancestral para recordarnos desde dónde venimos, es decir, quiénes somos como hijos e hijas de la tierra. Esto nos permite conectarnos profundamente con la tierra para rememorar nuestras propias relaciones de interconectividad con todos. Por último, quizás para agregar también, pensar un poco también en cómo esta relación intercultural, intergeneracional, nos permite también tener una relación interespiritual, tanto en las relaciones de quienes queremos aprender de estos conocimientos, no solamente desde una mente colonizada, sino también reconocer cómo nuestro cuerpo también puede ser descolonizado a partir de estas prácticas profundas de espiritualidad. Y finalmente concretar que yo creo que la educación allí en la pedagogía es muy necesario, pero una pedagogía, como diría el hermano Abadio Green, del pueblo cuna de la madre tierra, es decir, ¿qué nos enseña la tierra en este proceso de conocimiento? Yo creo que es muy importante entonces plantearnos varias preguntas más, que hay muchas respuestas, preguntas que nos lleven en ese camino.
Thank you very much, Jokobed. We have some questions that were addressed to Collins, and there is another one that I saw in the chat mentioning that youths are still left behind in some parts of Africa. And if you could share some experiences of how Zimbabwe has succeeded, or AACC in general, on this matter. But before you reply, I would like to add to ask to Fernanda and also Moura to be prepared to talk about it's mentioning about someone talk about the lack of freedom of religion and belief or presence of it, if that is affecting communities' life in harmony with nature, especially in the area of environmental conservation. That's the questions. And I would like to add that for you as well. Based on your experiences, what is the role faith actors can play in protecting nature and biodiversity and mobilizing others to do so? That is very much connected to the youth engagement. So we will start with Collins and then Fernanda and Moura.
Thank you so much for that question. I'll just say that I think in Zimbabwe, what has been successful so far has been the consultation of young people, where the government has been consulting with young people and working with young people in terms of climate change issues. And it's also been an issue where the government has been open to interact with interested citizens, interested people in climate change. And secondly, and most importantly, I think it has been the issue that the youth voices have been allowed and have been unignorable. So you couldn't ignore the voices that were coming out of the young people. You couldn't ignore the actions that are coming out of the young people. And then, yes, there was that push to include the voices of the young people. In some spaces, you could tell that the young people had no space there, but they were pushing themselves to the table, pushing themselves with their voices to the table, pushing themselves academically, pushing themselves in researches, pushing themselves in the spaces as well to ensure that their voices have been heard. And in terms of Africa or the parts of other parts of Africa, I wouldn't agree that most of them are left behind, but I can see that there have been some changes in many African countries, in Kenya, in Nigeria, in Ghana. Could see that the momentum of young people is coming up, and it has been largely because of the loud voices globally from the global spaces from young people that have been pushing the agenda on climate change. In Africa, we can talk of people like Vanessa Nakato who have been pushing the agenda on climate change, and those voices are hard to ignore for many governments in Africa and the world over. And the young people have been pushed that. It has been largely that. And once we get more youth voices that are active and that are pushing the climate change, the climate justice agenda in a systematic way and in a collective way, then we will get more and more young people occupying those spaces to influence the climate change agenda. And this is what we need in our spaces. And I didn't get the other part of the question, but I can see that there was some mention about AACC. And it's also the same that AACC has been consulting and working with young people to motivate them to push their voices up on issues of climate change and to push the climate change agenda. And that's what we need. We need collective voices from national level, continental level, and international level. So we need more youth voices coming up to ensure that the agenda of young people is listened to, the agenda of young people is pushed, the agenda of climate change also is achieved. Thank you.
Thank you, Collins. Fernanda?
Okay, it's not possible to meet the video. Okay, there goes. Ya, esta es una gran pregunta y creo que hay dos aristas en las cuales las organizaciones basadas en la fe y los jóvenes pueden desempeñarse. La primera de ellas es con el llamado que tenemos a la mayordomía de la creación, poder enseñarle al otro el debido cuidado de la creación, ya sea a través de la enseñanza, desde la teoría como desde la práctica. Y es aquí donde no podemos dejar atrás a nuestros jóvenes, es en esta tarea y que desde las distintas creencias tenemos el llamado a cuidar de nuestra creación. Y por otra parte, la otra arista, creo que es lo que estamos haciendo en este momento y que los jóvenes también pueden llevar a cabo. Es que necesitamos dejar de ver a los jóvenes como instrumentos para la acción climática, sino hacerlos parte de, a través de la incidencia pública, la incidencia política. No necesitamos buscar la mejor forma de desempeñarnos, sino que ya siendo parte de las negociaciones, interviniendo, proponiendo y desarrollando programas de trabajo, como ya lo hacen muchas de nuestras organizaciones, es que se pueden establecer como ejemplo para la movilización por parte de los jóvenes y de distintas organizaciones basadas en la fe. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Fernanda. Maura, the floor is yours.
In response to the question about the lack of freedom of religion and belief or presence of it, I think that in the case of the US and Europe, at least from a perspective where Christianity is the dominant culture, it could certainly be different for other religions, but I would mostly be able to speak to Christianity. There is freedom of religion, and people who are Christian are given the freedom to practice their Christianity. So I think it is a shortcoming of the church actually in this particular situation, rather than freedom of religion, that people are not necessarily engaging with environmental conservation and this connection with creation and protection of biodiversity in the environment. So at least in the US and in some parts of Europe, the church has specifically pushed some communities away and has really severed ties with the earth and roots to God's creation. So even if you think about in weekly practice, climate and environmental conservation are not necessarily taken into account. And I think that is not necessarily just because of a lack of freedom of religion, but because churches don't center conservation or biodiversity or connection with creation in their theological practice. So for example, centering congregations around a building that is maybe used once a week for weekly worship services doesn't necessarily to me seem to be maybe the best way to practice environmental conservation and this protection of biodiversity. Considering multiple uses for church space, but also sort of inviting communities, and as well as making the protection of communities and creation more of a priority for the church is probably where I see issues, rather than necessarily a freedom of religion in the US or Europe.
Thank you very much. I'm looking at the watch. We have some times for question, and I would like to have all the panelists responding to that. And the question comes, what sort of actions would you like to see congregations do or engage with more often to lift up and support climate justice, especially its impacts are not yet directly experienced in their own backyards? So we will make the round starting with MENA, then Fernanda, Jacobed, Collins, and Maura again. Very briefly, what kind of actions we would like to see your congregations, the global congregations, engage with to support climate justice? MENA.
Sorry, Rodamel, my audio gets a bit, you were cut off for a bit. Sorry, could I have that question repeated, please?
The question is, what sort of actions you would like to see congregations or the Pacific Conference of Churches engaging more often to ensure that churches and the faith communities will support climate justice? Very briefly, one action or...
I think for in the Pacific, because it is a very patriarchal and sometimes specifically just focused on the elders when it comes to decision making, I would really like to see Pacific congregations being more inclusive of young voices when it does come to climate activism or climate justice. We do bring a lot of, as I mentioned before, advocacy and awareness, and we can bring a lot of change to the table. So, and when it comes to decision making, young people's voices are really crucial in that area. So it would be really great to see that happen more often in our congregation. That's pretty much it. Especially young women's voices. So yeah, thank you.
That's very important. I think that that's a call to everyone here that are in this room, journalists, UN officials, religious leaders, civil society organizations, to get this call. Let's hear from Fernanda now.
Muchas gracias. Al contrario de lo que dice Lemaima, en mi congregación me gustaría ver a la gente, a las otras generaciones involucradas en las distintas acciones de cambio climático. Las acciones que se realizan, al menos en la Iglesia Luterana en Chile, son llevadas a cabo por jóvenes y nos gustaría ver involucrados a los adultos, a la tercera edad, que puedan tomar acción también y levantar sus voces sobre esto, que no solo implica a los jóvenes, sino que a todos los miembros de la Iglesia. Así que eso es lo que nos gustaría a nosotros ver, al menos acá en la Iglesia Luterana en Chile y en mi congregación en específico. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Fernanda. That's very true. We know that it's not only a situation in Latin America, but in many, many other regions that is happening. But let's see now from Hokabed. What's your call?
Bueno, a mí me gustaría ver una educación liberadora en contra de una educación que oprime la tierra y aún a las personas, es decir, una educación que pueda traer propuestas de cambios en lo holístico, es decir, en la espiritualidad de cómo vivimos nuestra relación con la tierra y por lo tanto eso trae incidencias políticas y de estados. Y que obviamente esta educación liberadora también nos permita estar en contra de una teología colonial que oprime los saberes de los pueblos indígenas. Gracias.
Thank you. Collins, what's your call?
Thank you. My call for our congregations in my context is to say that let's raise more awareness on climate change issues. And this can be done by ensuring that the communities locally can get some messages in their own language they understand. There's the practical actions within the church where the church service includes issues of climate change in the church service. And also, lastly, it's more of how do you work with young people to ensure that we have practical actions or practical ways of raising awareness on climate change from the congregational level. Issues like tree planting, how can we innovate around tree planting and so forth. And this is what we need in the context where people don't know much about what climate change means and what disaster will mean if we don't address climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Collins. And now I call Maura for sharing your call.
Direct mobilization and engagement with climate action at the local level. I think that conversations in congregations are the most important thing that faith organizations can do right now, because congregations might not be able to fund climate action on the world stage, but they can make a difference in their local communities. So there's this sort of snowball effect in mainstreaming climate conversations, like making the decision to do something like start a community garden or choosing renewable resources for energy consumption, even if it is more expensive, or incorporating climate change and the duty to conserve biodiversity into church conversations, we can drive wider conversations on the political level.
Yeah, sorry, Maura, there was a problem here with the translation that came Spanish over English. For those who had off all the translations, they didn't found that. But maybe can we, for all of those who wants to hear in English, put in the interpretation off, and your main points, Maura, please, if you could repeat.
Yes, am I being heard now? I'm going to go with yes. So mobilization and engagement with climate action at the local level, I think, are the most important things that congregations specifically can do. National Lutheran organizations and worldwide Lutheran organizations obviously have different policy programs. However, at the congregational level, they might not be able to fund climate action on the world stage. So making a difference in their local community is probably the best way to mobilize engagement with protection of creation and biodiversity. And this sort of snowball effect in mainstreaming climate conversations at the congregational level will bleed into and drive wider conversations at the political level and in local communities. So at least in Europe and North America, I think that those are the most beneficial ways that congregations could actively engage with this conversation.
Thank you very much for your double presentation. Thank you very much for that, Maura. And thank you all to all the speakers. Big thanks for your contributions and your responses, but also thanks to all the participants for your comments, questions, and engagement. It's amazing. I was accompanying the chat. We will save that and we will pass that to the speakers to provide additional information if we will be able to get you or to be in contact with you. We have learned a lot today, but listening these voices of hope and faith, we are in a better standing to engage in and mobilize, especially based on the calls that came up now at the end of these sessions, to mobilize collective action, global action to protect nature and biodiversity, but much more importantly, to engage in climate actions, not only good commitments or good intentions, but action. We cannot do alone. We know that. And the intersectionality and the intergeneration dimensions of issues, it's an important element to be taken into account, like indigenous knowledge that was mentioned several times, gender and economics. So we have a lot of good suggestions and good content for moving on. And to conclude, I will invite Professor Isabel Apau-Piri for the closing remarks of this event. And Professor Isabel is from Malawi, and she's the Deputy General Secretary of the World Council of Churches with responsibilities for the work in the areas of public witnesses and also diaconia, and that is the advocacy work of WCC. Before joining WCC, she was a professor of African theology, dean and head of the School of Religion, Philosophy and Classics, and director of the Center for Constructive Theology at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. I hope that I have pronounced well that, Isabel. Yeah. She edited the Journal of Gender and Religion in Africa and completed her PhD in Religious Studies from the University of Cape Town in South Africa. Dear Isabel, the virtual floor is yours.
Good. Thank you so much, Moderator Rudma, and good day to everyone. In this session, we had the privilege of listening to diverse voices of young persons, women, and indigenous peoples from different parts of the world. Some of our panelists have impacted stories of challenges and injustices wrought by a rapidly warming climate and the destruction of God's beautiful creation in the pursuit of wealth and in the name of development. Against the backdrop of stark findings of the second part of the sixth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released today, our panelists have also shared remarkable stories of resilience and action. For me, there are at least a couple of takeaways. First, even as socially marginalized groups tend to bear the brunt of ecological degradation, which they contribute least to, they are not simply victims. They are also carrying and propagating the seeds of solutions to the crises we face. Some of these solutions are rooted in the ancient cultures and practices of our ancestors. I particularly liked, the one that he connected the umbilical cord to tree planting. Some are innovative, harnessing new technologies or planting or platforms and creativity of youth. We need both. Second, spirituality plays an important role. Spirituality is key to carving out sustainable pathways to a better future. I'm talking about a spirituality that emerges from a deep understanding of how we are, human and non-human beings, and all interconnected in the web of life, a spirituality that then inspires us to serve the common good. This is something that we must learn from our indigenous brothers and sisters. I'm talking about a spirituality of resistance. This is a spirituality that heartens us to not tolerate social and ecological injustices, to challenge these injustices. And I'm talking about a spirituality of transformation and transformative spirituality that seeks to redeem all of creation and stirs us to explore imaginative ways of producing, consuming, and living differently, of building alternative narratives and practices of living harmoniously with all creation and treading gently on our only planetary home. As we heard today, young people, women, indigenous peoples are already showing us the way. In closing, and on behalf of the organizers of the side event at the UN Environmental Assembly, I would like to extend my thanks to the interpreters, who enabled sharing of perspectives across languages, and to our participants for joining us and enriching these discussions. And last